Hello everyone, welcome to the Labor Mobility Partnerships or LAM's fourth event in the series called Workers on the Move. Today we'll be focusing on the need for quality mobility industry. My name is Zuzana Cepla and I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at LAM. And before I jump into introductions of our today's fascinating lineup of speakers and panelists, allow me to just mention a few housekeeping points. Please leave your camera off and microphone muted during the speaker and panel portions of the event. There will be 2 Q&A sessions today, so you will get a chance to ask questions or state your comments then. However, you can certainly feel free to use the chat box throughout the event. The event is being recorded and will be published on our website later today, so look out for that and share with your networks, please. And last but certainly not least, this event actually accompanies the release of our latest report called A Good Industry and an Industry for Good, why we need a quality mobility industry to scale labor mobility. And I will add a link for the report to the chat box momentarily. But this is actually a good transition for me to the introductions of our speakers, starting with the LAM's Executive Director, Rebekah Smith, who will present findings from this new report. Prior to her work on LAM, Rebekah worked at the World Bank, building institutions in countries sending, receiving, and transit to facilitate labor migration. Her work there focused on fragile and conflict-affected states, providing technical assistance to government counterparts to strengthen capacity and systems to access international labor markets, with service delivery outsourced through performance-based contracts. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, or CGD, working with the Migration, Displacement, and Humanitarian Policy team, as well as with the Open Political Economy Network. She has a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's degree in economics and international studies from Ohio Wesleyan University. Our next speaker is Jason Wendle, who is acting as strategy lead for LAM. He is a director at the Global Development Incubator, where he has played critical leadership roles, designing and building initiatives for the last 5 years. Jason has served as Director of Strategy and Programs for the recently launched Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, which prioritizes private sector engagement to develop ethical alternatives in sectors affected by forced labor. And its largest area of programming is in the area of overseas labor recruitment. Before GDI, Jason was an associate partner in the Nairobi office of Dalbar Global Development Advisors, where he spent 7 years providing strategy advice to clients across a broad range of sectors, including impact investing, agriculture development, energy technology for development, and access to finance. Jason holds an MPA ID from Harvard's Kennedy School and has published and presented work on smallholder finance, SME banking, and impact measurements. Now, moving to our panelists, we have Alex Silberman, who is the General Manager of the Ethical Recruitment Agency, or TERA, which helps people benefit from migration while staying safe from exploitation. He has worked extensively in Afghanistan, India, the Middle East, and East Africa on innovative approaches to migration and displacement challenges. Prior to leading TERA, Alex led migration research and data projects for CFAR. He has conducted research for EU, member states, OCHA, IOM, NRC, DRC, and others. Alex has a Master of Public Policy from Georgetown University and a certificate in refugees and humanitarian emergencies from the Institute for the Study of International Migration. Then we have Joe Martinez, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of CRTO, a nonprofit farm worker recruitment and training organization that recruits, trains, and dispatches farm workers to agriculture employers in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. Previously, Joe was the International Labor Advocate Mexico Program Director for United Farm Workers. He coordinated and directed all the union's activities in Mexico and assisted coordinating the UFW's international work. Joe has worked closely with NGOs, the US, and foreign governments to address issues related to how farm workers are recruited and dispatched to the US and to establish labor agreements between Mexican state governments and the United Farm Workers. Joe has a BA in political science and a comparative history of ideas from the University of Washington. He is based in Tacoma, Washington. We also have Amit Saxena, who is a director at AMBE International, which is the first registered human resources consulting firm in India. Founded in 1979, it provides various recruitment solutions to its clientele spread across the globe. Amit has 20 years of experience with recruitment, training, and IT consulting, 8 years of experience in recruitment in India, Dubai, Oman, and Qatar. Now he is an entrepreneur with recruitment companies covering recruitment value chain, retail research, executive search for technical positions in oil and gas and workers, medical and hospitality recruitment. And last but certainly not least, we have our great moderator, Darin Kingston, who is currently acting as Organizational Development Lead at LAMP. Darin is a managing director at Global Development Incubator, where she has played key leadership roles, both internally and for several of GDI's major incubations over the past 5 years. Most recently, Darin served as the interim director of operations for the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, where she has accountable for all aspects of startup organization design and operationalization. Prior to GDI, Darin designed and implemented social impact strategies and programs at a range of mission-driven organizations. Immediately before joining GDI, she designed and executed the impact measurement strategy for a leading emerging markets consumer solar energy business. Darin earned an MA in International Affairs from Columbia University and a BA in International Relations from Brown University. So I think we have a great event ahead of us, and I will just give the word to Rebekah to begin the speaker portion of the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zuzana, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Let me get, all right. Hopefully you can all see that okay. So throughout this event series that many of you have joined us for, we've been exploring the case for labor mobility from the lens of different existing actors. Today is going to be a bit different. Now we're moving to looking at labor mobility from the lens of a missing actor, that of a quality mobility industry. This also marks, as we'll discuss later, LAMP's transition from examining existing systems to proposing new ones. So we'll talk about that after this. So those of you who have been following LAMP's work are very familiar with this argument. This is the starting point, really, of all of our work and arguments. So using UNDESA's zero migration scenarios, by 2050, OECD countries, which, as you see on the left-hand side, have a shrinking working age population, are projected to lose 92 million working age people and gain 96 million elderly people. Now, this means that in order to maintain their already currently historically low ratios of working age people to elderly, they would need an additional 400 million workers by 2050, or an additional 15 million workers per year. Now, I know that this sounds a bit dry and technical, but actually that ratio is fed into many of our systems and the way really that all of us lives our lives. It's fundamentally baked into public health systems, pension systems, so that ratio is critically important and very much under threat at the moment. Now, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, low-income countries face exactly the opposite demographic challenge. They're looking at 1.4 billion new working age people in lower income countries. And the challenge by 2050, and the challenge there is finding productive employment for all of these new working age entrants. Under our projections, only an estimated 590 million of these 1.4 billion can expect to have access to productive employment opportunities, leaving many million to need to come up with new employment solutions. These demographics are what we call an irresistible force towards labor mobility. However, this irresistible force is pushing against the immovable object of political resistance to immigration. So on the left-hand side here, we have a chart that I have stolen from Helen Dempster, who I believe is on the call with us today and has done some wonderful work on public perceptions around mobility that you should all take a look at. But this is looking at how Europeans view immigration and mobility. And what you can see, the key bar here is this yellow bar of what's called the anxious middle. And this anxious middle is now believed within migration circles to be really the key determinant of migration policies and public perceptions around migration. The anxious middle means they're neither particularly for mobility nor against mobility, as would be the blue and green bars. These are the ones who are somewhat indifferent to it but have valid concerns. So we think that in order to break the gridlock on labor mobility, we need to create mobility solutions that appeal to this anxious middle. We propose that temporary mobility could be a just right solution for this political impasse on mobility. Temporary mobility offers a solution that is neither between hosting foreign workers permanently nor about not allowing foreign workers in and simply facing the demographic crisis that we posed in the previous slide. Many of the anxious middle's concerns are around the cultural impacts of mobility. While significant attention is paid to the political implications of the economic and distributional consequences of mobility, these distributional effects also apply to the movement of goods and capital in terms of trade across borders. And yet there's much more resistance to mobility, and scholars believe that this resistance is coming from concerns around the cultural impact of allowing people from other countries to come into your borders. This leads our research director, Lant Prish, to argue that of all the ideas that limit migration, perhaps the most important is the idea that there is a national culture and that increased labor mobility threatens that culture. So temporary labor mobility offers a solution where we have workers that answer both the labor scarcity and demographic needs of high-income countries, that provide jobs for workers in the low-income countries, and don't create this perceived or real cultural threat. So we view it as potentially politically viable. Now, there are several examples, as you can see on the right-hand side, of existing temporary mobility programs that exist today and are operating to very good effect. However, there are no temporary mobility programs that are both operating well and operating at large scale. So this is the challenge we need to be solving. So the question is, why precisely aren't temporary mobility programs more invested in and viewed as a legitimate solution to the demographic crisis that we are facing both in high-income and low-income countries? And we believe the answer to this is that temporary mobility is often viewed as illegitimate due to the bad outcomes that are currently rampant in these systems. So while, as we have said in many events before this, we view labor mobility as one of the most powerful tools for poverty alleviation and increasing global well-being, the way that systems are currently designed in terms of the poor incentives we see on the left-hand side here leads to a number of bad outcomes that both undermine the positive impacts for all of the actors in labor mobility systems and that undermine the legitimacy of temporary mobility programs. So it is very common for workers to pay thousands of dollars in migration costs. For example, a result by Verite, a US-based NGO, found that workers from Latin America and Asia paid service providers between $3,000 and $27,000 to secure visas to the United States. This is a significant portion of their earnings even while abroad, and more importantly, because it's paid up front, results in high indebtedness, often at very high interest rates, that traps the worker in often very low quality employment situations. Even worse, these migrants are paying upfront into a system without any assurance that they're getting what they're paying for. So migrants arriving in the receiving country often find that the job is not what they were promised or expected, and the pay is not what they were promised. For example, another Verité report found that 43% of Nepali migrants interviewed signed a different contract after arrival than the one that they signed before departing their home country, and that the terms were generally different than those that they originally agreed to, and 36% never signed any contract at all. This results, as we've already said, in high indebtedness and very high costs to the workers, but also results often in worker abuse and very poor job quality and conditions. So all of this means that temporary labor mobility systems face political challenges from both the anti-immigrant crowd who simply doesn't want to allow foreign workers in, and those who are legitimately concerned about the rights of workers. So we argue that solving these problems on the slides in front of you would make temporary mobility programs more politically viable, which in turn makes scaling labor mobility more politically viable. Now, a lot of attention is paid to the bad outcomes that I just discussed. However, and so the solution that's often proposed is simply getting rid of the role of industry actors. However, and so this has led to the emergence of models like government-to-government programs that we see, for example, in the Korea example that was on the slide before, or in Japan's new specified skills visas. However, these government-to-government programs, which rely on public employment services on both sides of the border, often are run at very, very small scale because they're limited by government capacity. In public employment services on both sides of the border, which is often quite weak, and especially quite weak in lower income sending countries. So when we think about building labor mobility systems at scale, we need to think of solutions that address the bad outcomes I discussed previously, but that allow the system to operate at scale. And we argue that that requires quality industry support. As you can see on the slide in front of you, we go through the migration process both without any professional support and with the support of a professional quality industry. And we argue that going to scale requires a quality mobility industry. And we further argue that that's actually something we should actively want, that there are a number of benefits for all actors in mobility systems of quality industry support. So we would posit that the right solution is to not simply getting rid of the bad outcomes and excluding the role of industry actors, but rather facilitating the emergence of a quality mobility industry. So from the lens of employers, industry support is incredibly important because it helps to reduce the barriers for employers of hiring workers from abroad. So the more quality industry actors you have, it decreases the costs of quality industry support, which for employers makes it more accessible to hire workers abroad. This is especially important for small and medium enterprises, which we argue in our new report is an increasingly important actor in the future of labor mobility systems, as many of the jobs that we predict being growing jobs in the future are kind of at the scale of services, which are often delivered through SMEs. Similarly, for employers and workers alike, industry actors are what we would consider knowledge agents, and they maintain a lot of very specialized knowledge that is difficult for both employers and workers to access on their own. So for workers, while the existing low quality industry actors create significant problems, a good quality mobility industry actually holds a lot of knowledge that they need in order to be able to access jobs abroad, such as where the good vacancies are, how to know whether a job is a good job, what jobs they might be qualified for, what the migration process is. And actually all of this knowledge is especially important for more vulnerable job seekers, such as those who are poor or live in rural areas or maybe illiterate. So actually having a quality mobility industry is incredibly important to increasing the equity of mobility systems. And then finally, for migration systems as a whole, not only would a quality mobility industry build trust between all actors, but I really want to focus in on the last point, which is it would turn good practice into good policy. At LAMP, we have a saying that good policy comes from good practice, and good practice comes from practice. So because there's very few temporary mobility programs operating in a quality way right now, we actually have very little knowledge on how to design them well and what works in practice. As a result, many of our labor mobility policies are actually designed in a way that actively leads to bad outcomes, that incentivize overstay or increase abusive employment by not letting workers change jobs. So there's actually a lot of problems built into the policies around temporary mobility programs. At LAMP, we argue that by allowing a quality mobility industry to operate and document the results of their operations, we can then communicate those findings to policymakers and lead to better policy design, which in turn leads to just this virtuous cycle of increasing the viability of mobility, political viability of mobility flows. On the right or on the left-hand side here, we can also show that not only should we want a quality mobility industry, but that it's simply commercially viable. If you look at the gain to workers based on some really actually conservative assumptions that we've put there in terms of the wage gains per worker, you see that if we accounted only for half of the needed flows that I told you about before, and use this conservative estimate of a $15,000 wage gain per worker, this would result in a $3 trillion gain annually to mobile workers. That's an economy the size of India. If we were to put only 1% of those gains into financing the services of a quality mobility industry, that's a very viable industry size. However, for a quality mobility industry to be feasible, we also need public goods to support its emergence. So the first thing that we need is to convince employers that they should be working with quality mobility industry actors rather than kind of their existing relationships with low quality mobility industry actors. That requires demonstrating that there is a viable business case, and we're going to talk about this more later in our panel. The second is simply connecting new actors with market opportunities and building this network within the industry so that new actors have a way to kind of establish themselves in the space. We also need a way to systematically identify market opportunities. Very little information is out there on, for example, where labor demand might be or where the labor supply of workers that match that demand is. So we need to more systematically undertake that analysis. And finally, we need agreed standards across all actors that are viable at scale, and that can be met in kind of a realistic and achievable way. So we need to provide these public goods in order for private actors to establish themselves within a quality mobility industry. So LAMP's next phase of work, and I'm not going to talk about this right now, is focusing on how we can move towards facilitating that quality mobility, those public goods in that quality mobility industry. I'm going to now hand it over to our strategy lead, Jason Wendle, who's actually going to talk about what that process looks like and tell you more about the next stage of our work. So over to you, Jason. Jason, you're on mute.
Jason, you're
once you start sharing the screen, the buttons go into a totally different place. Great. Great, thank you, Rebekah. It's been, as you mentioned, to transform the labor mobility industry requires a lot of changes in the way services are currently delivered. And in addition, it also requires a lot of changes to the way sending governments and receiving governments act, and even the way workers and employers act. And so there's a broad sort of transformation that is needed, and it's a multi-stakeholder effort to do so. Right now, what this slide shows is that LAMP is hoping to fill the need for a labor mobility field or industry builder, but basically to meet some of this coordination need, given the complexity of these systems and the number of stakeholders that all need to be facilitated to achieve this goal of a transformed labor mobility industry. What this slide shows is just a mapping, and this is illustrative. It's not a perfectly scientific analysis, but it shows that there are actors in this space that are particularly nationally focused or private sector focused. There are others that are global or public good focused. But then the focus of such efforts may range between broad migration issues versus exclusively labor mobility questions. And where it seems like there's a bit of a gap is labor mobility itself as a global public good. And LAMP is looking to help fill that gap, and in so doing, coordinate with these different groups of organizations along the way. So potential allies in the global public good space, multilaterals, et cetera, but also sending and receiving and recruiting agencies and associations, which you can see on the bottom right corner, which have a private interest primarily, but they are dedicated to labor mobility. And then in the bottom left corner, you could talk about country policymakers, regulators, receiving country employers who can have concerns about broader migration issues as well. But ultimately, all of these stakeholders are going to need to work together to transform the industry. And LAMP really feels like there's a need to help in that coordination process. And as Rebekah was saying, that's where some of the transition that we've been discussing is going to be heading. There's a big vision that's clear that we need a global platform for a good labor mobility industry. And LAMP to date has been a visionary and a service provider around labor mobility and really trying to make a case for the value of temporary labor mobility. But at the moment, there's a need for a transition state. We can't just immediately jump to the world where there exists a good labor mobility industry and a global platform to coordinate it, but there's a transition period that LAMP in itself has to go through. And some of the key objectives in this transition state is to generate proof points for the types of labor mobility partnerships that can be the building blocks of this new industry. As Rebekah said a few times, we have some good examples out there, but there's really not a lot happening at large scale. So this slide, as Rebekah already showed, explains the process or the theory of change, moving from developing a case to demonstrating, this bottom green box, that good practice is possible at a scalable level if you can have some well-designed and well-executed labor mobility partnerships. And the theory here is that if we can do that, we're going to be able to generate more evidence on impact. We're going to generate evidence on feasibility. So can this actually work? And can you get all the players in this fragmented landscape to come together? And then we believe we can bring in champions and luminaries and the types of visionaries that are needed to bring in additional funding and momentum to really catalyze a sectoral transformation. And we think that that can lead us to a platform for industry transformation, which ultimately gets to this goal of a transformed labor mobility industry that's creating more options and dramatically positive outcomes for workers, as well as positive benefits for sending and receiving economies at scale. So I won't go, we're giving you a little insight into kind of some of the internal deliberations of LAMP, just so you have a sense of where LAMP itself is heading, and hopefully if there are ways where you all as partners of LAMP can play a role. But I'm not going to go into all the intricate details of this slide or some of these internal strategy slides that we're working for, but we thought it was useful to just give you a sense of what we think is happening in the next 6 to 12 months. There are some different models that could inform LAMP's transition state. At present, LAMP has been something between a think tank and a service provider on the left side of this slide, really trying to shine a light on labor mobility as a goal, and also amplifying good models where it can, and also providing services to support some labor mobility partnerships. But we think that because of the lack of a sufficient number of proof points at scale, it's likely that LAMP will also need to add an element of an incubator to its model, where it's designing and testing and deploying innovative new partnership models, and that this will also have a community of practice element. And this involves bringing people together, just like on this call, but key players who also share this vision for transformed labor mobility, bringing these players together in a community of practice, sharing knowledge, etc. These models are not meant to be a prescriptive set of things that LAMP has to be or do, but it's the types of examples that LAMP is considering as it enters this transition state. And to just give a concrete example of what that can look like, and to tee up our conversation for the rest of today, there are already some illustrative ideas of how LAMP could build proof points and try to facilitate these concrete demonstrations of temporary labor mobility partnerships. So I'll walk through a few of these, just giving some highlights, and some of the colleagues here who are going to speak next actually will be able to talk even at greater depth. So for example, there's potentially an opportunity for new labor mobility programs in the India-Japan corridor. Why do we think that? We know that 14 sectors in Japan have been approved for temporary labor mobility, but there's been limited progress to date. And so what LAMP is trying to figure out is, what are the barriers to that happening? Why has there not been progress? And can we bring together the governments, employers, recruiters, and develop a program that addresses their interests? One of the key questions that LAMP is looking at is, like, what's the best way to engage the Japanese government? Because of course, destination side governments are critical players in this puzzle. Another option, which we have Joe Martinez on the line who can talk through his particular model at Cierto, but there's small examples of ethical agricultural recruitment in North America happening. And if we could find a way to scale those models to reach many more thousands of workers, we could demonstrate what good quality labor recruitment looks like that is beneficial both for workers and employers. Here, it may mean thinking about the buyers and the farms, and how do you incentivize more farms to adopt and to insist upon ethically sourced workers. Another option or potential area that we're exploring right now is, can we expand the efforts of leading destination countries? So countries like Canada and Germany that are already on the cutting edge in terms of labor mobility, are there ways that LAMP can help them go further? You could think about working on occupation-specific visas or community-sponsored visas instead of employer-sponsored visas, and further demonstrating what good can look like. Questions there are around, what's the right set of countries to start with? How can you develop something that's additional to what these countries are already doing? And then a final example would be Ibero-American corridors, where there's potential demand in places like Spain and Portugal for Latin American workers. And there's a need, though, to, again, bring the key players to the table, and can we establish some concrete partnership models that can demonstrate that this would work. This, of course, doesn't exclude opportunities to continue to support or spotlight existing programs, but our analysis suggests that there just are not as many out there in the world as we want there to be. And so in this transition period for LAMP, the hope is to start to create more of these examples, and then to be able to point to a concrete set of cases and evidence that this really can work. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we will go into a period of Q&A. Is that right?
Hi, yeah, that's right. So we're going to pause briefly here. We are going to move over to our panel in just a moment, and there's a lot of very exciting things we want you to hear from them. So we're just going to pause briefly here because we realize that we just put a lot of information on the table. And this is really, as Jason has told you, moving us towards kind of our next phase of work. And especially given how many allies we have on the call, we're really interested to both hear from you and to take your questions. So we'll pause briefly here for any questions. You can either put them in the chat box or just turn your camera on and pop up and say hello. And then we'll move over to our panel. All right, we'll give it just a minute more, and then we'll move over to hearing from our panelists. Excellent. Okay, let's move to the panel. There will also, of course, be our usual Q&A session at the end. So if you think of anything between now and then, feel free to ask it then as well. Oh, wait, we might have had a hand up. Gonzalo, was that you?
Yes.
Sorry, hi.
That's fine. That's all fine. No problem. Hi, how are you? It was fantastic presentation, really inspiring. Thank you very much. My question is very concrete. What potential do you see in the Global Compact as a tool, as a vehicle for this? Because there was a lot of political capital invested in it a couple of years ago. It is still a framework that is often mentioned by governments, at least in the European context, and this is something that we are also trying to reanimate in the light of the consultation of the legal migration. And I wonder if you perceive that there is any potential whatsoever in that context, if you think that there is anything practical that can be done out of it at this stage. Thank you.
I think that's a much better question to you, Gonzalo. I think you likely know more than I do about how viable that is. I mean, I think we've certainly seen a good bit of momentum on trying to actually implement the compact. Whether that momentum kind of maintains moving forward, I think, is a decently large debate within migration circles. I think it's certainly worth trying. The way that I would frame it is I do think that governments are very hungry for concrete solutions from what we've heard. LEMP has been partnering in the last year also with the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and kind of what that experience has taught us is that everyone is very keen, just for partnerships in practice rather than kind of broad global statements, and that they're hungry for partnerships that can scale, that have kind of a scaling mechanism built into them. So I think the demand is there. I know that the regional reviews of the GCM are coming up, so that may be a way to jump in. But that's something I would certainly love really more of your reflections on, or anyone else who's around the table.
I couldn't say, to be honest, because I don't know. I know how practical this can get, and that is why I think that, I mean, to the extent that it provides a political momentum, I think that we should take advantage of it. And in those countries where it doesn't play any role, I think that we should just leave it aside, no? But in some cases, I think it can be useful.
I think it's about knowing where the entrance points are, right, in terms of like very discrete, well-defined kind of between two countries in a specific industry even. And then, as you say, like if that's a lever in those entrance points, then using it. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Gonzalo, and lovely to see you. Let's hand it over now to Darin to open up the panel.
Okay, let's see. Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me all right. And then I guess I'll ask Joe, Alex, and Amit to also join by camera and audio here. Hi, everybody. Okay, great. So as Zuzana mentioned, we constitute your panel. I'll be moderating. This is Darin Kingston speaking. And then we have Joe Martinez, Alex Silberman, and Amit Saxena here to discuss with us. And try to both give them a chance to share more about their particular lens and work as intersects the conversation that we're having, and also tie back to some of the themes that Rebekah and Jason teed up for us. So maybe to start, Amit, I'll start with you. And you've been involved in the labor mobility space for quite a while now. Could you tell us more about UNBE's model and how it has evolved and adapted over the years to meet changing circumstances?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Darin. Thanks to Lam for having me. So good evening to all of you all. I'm logged in from Mumbai. It's a crisp night. It's 21 degrees here, and it's 10:15 in the evening. Um, so Ambe's, the company I run is a 40-year-old organization. I'm not that old personally. I'm a second generation entrepreneur. Um, and we do recruit a fairly large number of people out of India and a couple of other countries. We're an end-to-end HR services firm, so we don't only do recruitment, we also train and skill workers, which we believe is an increasingly important part of labor mobility. It's an increasingly important part of some of the tides of change that we're seeing during COVID, where the requirement of labor, when you use that word, it signifies just an unqualified worker. That's at least the context we use it in India. And it's more about mobility of skills is the way we're looking at it in India. We have an entire ministry of skills in this country. So we do programs under their aegis. So there's a significant component of our business, which is training and skilling. Then comes the recruitment and the mobilization. And I treat these differently because, recruitment is about matching the employer and the employee. And the mobilization is a completely different set of complexities in terms of documentation and processes. And then, of course, the last one is where we do set up a presence in the receiving countries as well. And this is key. I can't stress how important this is to the success of achieving this at scale. Where being able to receive workers in the receiving countries help create onboarding programs, orientation programs, and sometimes we even provide payroll support and payroll services to our clients. It's key to making this work, especially in countries where there may not be a history of recruiting workers from the sending country, where there may not be a lot of cultural alignment, as in the case of Japan or Germany, where the language is different, the food is entirely different, the weather is completely different. There needs to be an element of cultural alignment in the receiving country. So that's what we do at Ambe. We run the gamut. We do all of these pretty much.
Thank you. That's a super helpful just orientation to kind of the full value chain, if you will. So maybe Joe and then Alex, to go to you two next, sort of similar question. Could you tell the group here just about how your respective organizations models work, and maybe a bit of the origin story too, in terms of what caused you, sort of what was the impetus behind these organizations, and sort of where are you now in your journey?
Thank you, Darin. And thank you to LAMP also for hosting us. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into this. So Cierto was originally created based off of a lot of the work that I was doing trying to lobby legislation and create binational agreements between the US and Mexico corridor. The idea was to get the Department of Labor of each country respectively on board to ensuring which visas were real and which recruiters were registered. Knowing the limitations that bureaucracy can have, that's what we hit up against. A lot of well-intentioned folks that want to get this done, but the cogs of a government sometimes take a lot longer to move. And so what we had recognized is in collecting data to support our lobbying and legislation, we had actually created a network in 10 different sending states in Mexico with NGOs, nonprofits, pastoral social groups that had helped us connect to the communities of origin and build trust. And where through this, we had interviewed approximately 600 farm workers in these 10 different sending states to better understand what was it that they needed to gain access legitimately, transparently, and ethically to jobs in the US, specifically in seasonal agriculture. And it was through this that Cierto was born, predicated on the premise of how can we ensure that no worker pays for the right to work in the United States, knowing that that simple impediment there automatically denies a worker from being able to focus on their job at hand and instead presents them in a more emergency feel where they need to pay the debt that they're in. And so, and this has a ripple effect. This has a ripple effect to the employers who want to do things right and want to implement certifications and procedures and protocols within their company to improve, conditions. Yet, how can you get a worker to engage when their first focus is, I need to pay off my debt? And so it was through that understanding that Cierto was born as a nonprofit with the intention of collaborating with multiple entities and learning how to engage the supply chain. And so not only do we work with the employers and the workers, but we also engaged with retailers who are dependent on these labor supply chains to ensure their continuity of supply or surety of supply and their brand integrity. Because the reality is that ethical and clean recruitment in and of itself is not incentivized quite yet. And I think that that comes down to the reality that Rebekah and Jason has presented, is that there's a lot of actors that want to promote this, but that are very few that can do this at scale. And absent having an opportunity to demonstrate this work at scale, there's really, the difficult challenge there is to demand it, right? And so, for Cierto, we started out small, recognizing that we needed to build trust within the communities of origin just as much as with employers. But over the course of these last 6 years, I think we've been able to demonstrate that a community-based approach that verifies and ensures an ethical and transparent process can be successful and scalable. And what that means is that workers, for us, when we go to recruit them, we not only identify and ensuring that they know what work they're actually applying for, but we also train them on soft skills such as listening, conflict resolution, continuous improvement. And what we're really trying to identify is that there isn't really a non-skilled worker or non-qualified, as Amit said. There is workers that need those skills to be able to better perform. And that we're trying to demonstrate that a trained and professional workforce can bring much more added value to the employers who are looking to seek them out. And what we're really looking to identify in Cierto is we ensure that there are no subcontractors within our process. Everything is done in-house through the organization in the communities of origin as well as the country of destination. Just like Amit said, I think it's important to be present throughout the whole process. And then in turn, we also have a secondary verification process to ensure the contract that we took workers to is being met and fulfilled and that they have opportunity to air their grievances. And then lastly, when they return home, another series of interviews that happen there to ensure, hey, you're now home in your safe place. Please let us know, how can we continue to improve? And so it's predicated on not only conducting recruitment and training, but a continuous improvement process to better adapt labor mobility for the labor force within agriculture and ultimately the retail industry.
Thank you, Joe. Alex, over to you.
Well, thank you. And, just want to start again by thanking Rebekah and the LAMP team just for the opportunity to speak today and be a part of such great panelists. So just a little bit about Terra. Terra is an initiative of CFAR, which is a social enterprise that works globally on issues of migration, displacement, and social inclusion. And from all of our research and programming in places like Afghanistan and Indonesia and the Horn of Africa, we were seeing similar dynamics to the kinds of things that we heard earlier today and from Joe as well just now, just about the need for innovation when it comes to migrant worker recruitment, not just to benefit workers, but to support businesses as well. And so we launched the Ethical Recruitment Agency, or Terra, about 2 years ago. And Terra's mission is to help people benefit from migration while staying safe from exploitation. So unlike most recruiters, Terra is actually able to guarantee labor compliance. So solving some of those bad outcomes that we heard earlier, not just bad outcomes for workers. We all know about the exploitation that happens before, during, and after recruitment, but also bad outcomes for companies, things like compliance risks, for example. So specific to our model, our model kind of rests on 4 pillars. We don't employ sub-agents, much like Joe was just talking about. We directly recruit our workers and we're with them from start to finish. We don't charge recruitment fees. We provide pre-departure training to all of our workers, and we monitor our workers while they're abroad. Terra works across different sectors and migration corridors. So the GCC is a big focus for us. Our flagship hub right now is we recruit workers from India, and we also recruit workers from West Africa and Afghanistan. Some of the sectors that we work in include facilities management and construction, but the heart of what we do is really supporting vulnerable people. So that tends to be low-skilled jobs, low-skilled labor. And just in addition to some of the recruitment services that we offer, Tara is also really keen to build the body of evidence on ethical recruitment. So just recently, we published research through our partnership with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. And part of what our research is about is helping some of the smaller capacity businesses to understand the importance of professional recruitment, or the quality mobility industry that we're talking about here. So that's just a brief introduction to Tara, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And so, yeah, that's a really good, actually, pivot point to sort of next area of questions around this idea of sort of incentivizing employers, your clients in sort of, in some senses, towards this, whether we use the terminology around professional recruitment, quality recruitment, ethical recruitment, and sort of how, what the entry points are for that, and sort of how to grow that over time. And maybe, Amit, to go back to you, could you reflect a bit on the recruitment landscape in India, and how has a quality organization like Ambe been able to compete against a large market of lower quality actors?
So the recruitment industry in India, for especially for people going abroad, is actually fairly well regulated. Anyone who wants to recruit someone outside India actually operates under a license from the Ministry of External Affairs, and we do operate under that license. That license does have its own definition of what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is legal, what is not, what's illegal, what's safe, what's not safe. So that's pretty well regulated, to be honest with you. Having said that, there's a huge body of migration that happens, which is outside this structured sort of practice, or the structured law, and that's where I dare say most of the problems sort of come from, where most of the challenges come from. And just in terms of how Ambe manages to operate, I mean, firstly, we're a 40-year-old organization, so we've been successful and been doing this for so long because there is, of course, a set of values which we do follow. Whether that's ethical, it's employer paid or not, that's an entirely different discussion. But there is a set of fixed values that we follow. We do have a brand and a positioning that we stand for with the job seekers. Which is why we recruit a few thousand of them every year. Well, last year we recruited 8,000 people to various parts of the globe. We have deep industry expertise in whichever industry we operate in. So, we employ our own engineers, our own technical assessors. We normally will have, we may just end up employing the HR folks who oversee the projects which get executed in the receiving countries. And as I've already said, we do set up in destination countries. Normally, at least the cultural integration. My co-panelist Alex talked about the pre-departure orientation. It's actually now mandated for anyone who holds a license in India to support the PDOT program. We're right now supporting it for 50% of our migration outside through our agency, but the government of India intends to make it a 100% coverage program. And I will say one thing more about this is that I think Joe touched on this very carefully. This is a human resources business. So anyone who operates in this business understands that it's not possible to run this like a product business, right? Because you're dealing with human beings. There will be friction, there will be issues. It's how you handle the issues which is important. So we institutionalize grievance redressal mechanisms. We make it very easy for candidates to contact us with their grievances either during the process before they leave, or even after they've reached the destination countries. There are processes in which, if there is an issue, they can vent to those issues. And it's not only issues raised by the workers, it can also be issues raised by the employers. And both really need to be addressed with, sometimes we forget that sustainability comes when both are happy. If you're just trying to keep the worker happy, that's not going to work either. It really needs to be a fair process. So we do set up these institutional grievance mechanisms, which I think has really stood us in good stead over the years and created a differentiator for us.
Thank you. And Joe, maybe to pick back up on your model, could you share a bit more with the group about sort of how your model works in terms of the cost share between the workers and employers, and how you've been able to tell the story to sort of reorient the mind shift around who's paying for what, and the sort of perception of higher cost for higher quality from the employers.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that that's been one of the biggest challenges to this work, is that the status quo currently as it exists in the culture of recruitment is one that's not very visible. Therefore, expecting companies to have to pay that many times all the costs fall on the employer is a tough one to swallow. Anytime that I think the first approach that we have to look at this, and especially as a recruiter myself, is I'm partnering with the employer to be able to translate and share their culture and their goals with the workforce that they're trying to create, and the dependency on their mobility of their workforce. So that's the first understanding we really try to tackle. But the second is also recognizing, what can we do to promote employers that are doing things the right way? How do we get them in front and access to the retailers, specifically within our industry of agriculture, to recognize this is what good looks like, and how do we start to incentivize that? Unfortunately, the reality is that we're still ahead of the curve, and there have been mandates on behalf of large companies such as Walmart, right, to have an ethical labor supply chain by 2026, and other folks, Costco and Amazon, who want to bring sustainability, traceability to their labor supply chains. But unfortunately, that's just not at the majority in the market yet to be able to demand that outright. And so those are some of the challenges that we face currently. But I think what we've been successful is, first of all, not only demonstrating that we can offer clean recruitment and a better relationship, but is actually bringing the relational aspect to recruitment and business, recognizing that these workers can actually build a life plan through the opportunity that you provide them. And so it's in this sense that we've been able to identify how workers can work more collectively with the employer to improve processes. And so we're entering into a new stage where Cierto at first, within the first 4 to 5 years, had to prove we could do this community-based approach and maintain a clean recruitment process. Now, what we're really starting to step into is identifying and demonstrating the impact that our training program is having to actually improve productivity and decrease damage and decay for the products that are being harvested. So I'm really excited because I think that we're actually now starting to enter into an economic analysis that's going to demonstrate why clean and ethical recruitment translates into good business and overall impacting the whole labor supply chain.
Great, thank you. And Alex, similar question to you, what has worked in terms of this sort of total cost, total value conversation with employers, and sort of some of these perception shifts that have been touched on by Amit and Joe? And frankly, what are some of the barriers to having, more buy-in around that way of thinking?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I'd start by just agreeing with what Joe and Amit said. The good news is that I do think we're seeing growing demand among employers, growing awareness. There's been a big push in this area by industry and activists, just to kind of gain understanding for things like employer pays or following a particular ethical code of conduct. But with that said, I think demand is still relatively low in the industry. I think one of the things that Tara's been observing is that businesses are extremely reluctant to be the first mover. And I really liked how Joe was framing it in terms of trying to promote those businesses that take the risk on a new business model, so that you can really showcase the value for them. I think one of the things we've been observing is that though there are lots of wonderful industry initiatives that aim to kind of raise the tide, change the standards for the entire industry, a lot of those conversations tend to be limited to CSR departments. And while those are really great initiatives, you need to bring in the procurement folks into the conversation. And when we've talked with organizations that have C-level buy-in, that are actually connecting us with their human resources department, we're talking dollars and cents, and really breaking down the transparent recruitment fee model. I think that's where you see a lot of progress and a lot of understanding. When those conversations are limited to things like, we're doing this as a pilot, we're doing this for good public relations, but not necessarily seeing it as a value proposition to improve our business and protect our supply chain, that's where we run into more barriers.
And just an open question to all three of you, like, you know, you've mentioned a sort of positive shift, a shift in the right direction. You know, what are some of the key drivers of that shift, and are there ways in which your three organizations are trying to sort of create more of that?
Well, I'll take a first crack at it, and excited to hear what Joe and Amit have to say. We just produced a report called Profitable Ethical Recruitment that really dug into one specific example of the trends that we're seeing. And we looked at the GCC construction engineering sector. And this research, which was supported by GFEMS, found that there are a number of different drivers that are really making not just an ethical case for responsible recruitment or quality mobility, but there are a number of just pure business factors that are pushing the private sector in that direction. A few that come to mind include things like changing regulations at destination countries. We're seeing a rise in the GCC of increasing labor mobility. You no longer need employer permissions to change jobs, for example. So if you're not going to ethically employ workers, there's a higher risk that workers can move. We're seeing things like competitive advantages to companies that use BIM technology. And part of that kind of new way of thinking in a conservative sector is a professional recruitment sphere. And then, of course, you have trends like rising enforcement, and that's particularly relevant not just in destination countries, but for the multinational companies. The Modern Slavery Act is highly applicable to them. So a combination of these factors, at least for Terra, we've seen driving increased demand in ethical recruitment. But I do think I'd caution or temper that optimism with a lot of these trends are industry specific, and some industries are well advanced compared with others.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Alex said there. And I think that as an organization, which mandate is to try to propel and promote, good practices, is we've had to take, an initiative in trying to reach out to all the various actors that exist within this realm. Similar to what we saw, Rebekah sharing earlier and Jason, and looking at all those global actors, we ourselves reached out to the ILO, the International Labor Organization, to the Office of International Migration, with one key focus is bringing our model to light and being able to recognize those that can recognize best practices and helping us reinforce that what we're doing is actually correct. And with that, then using that leverage to go back to retailers to demonstrate to them, this isn't just something that we're doing that's a goodwill. Because one of the concepts that happen many times when you think about ethical recruitment process is the focus on solely the worker. And so I think one of our challenges too has been able to demonstrate that not only are we thinking about the worker, we're also thinking about the economic bottom line and what this does to the incurred costs of product. And so in that sense, it's really been a challenge for us to not only promote all these good actors, but also invite federal governments as resource partners to be able to share what we're doing, to see if there can be further collaboration. Similar to, I think, that diagram that I really enjoyed is it's really developing an ecosystem that recognizes that it has to be braided together to create the environment for ethical and transparent recruitment to thrive. And I think that right now that the focus of ethical and transparent recruitment isn't enough. It has to be combined with recognizing economic impact that brings added value. And so that's really the mandate that I feel Cierto has at the high level to be able to promote and demonstrate, and excited to hopefully do that here within the next 2 to 3 years. But I say that's kind of what remains at the challenge, while at the same time trying to continue to streamline operations. And one big aspect of that is bringing technology into the forefront, especially when we work with what most considered non-skilled labor forces. And so I think in there, those are the added challenges as well, to continually be focused on how to create better efficiencies for this process, so that you're also looking at current innovations and don't close yourself off to just doing one thing the way it's always been done.
So I love the word that Alex used, responsible recruitment rather than ethical recruitment. I like that word. So, we definitely see a lot of our clients, especially in GCC as well as Europe, talking about responsible recruitment, and especially for, some of the larger organizations, that is turning out to be an imperative. But, all organizations eventually, unfortunately, pray at the altar of profits, and this becomes a litmus test. If you cannot do responsible recruitment at market compatible rates, that continues to be a challenge. I do want to add one more point over here, which is, I'm from India, so I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room here, which is what the pandemic has done is it's widened the gap between the number of jobs available and the applicants. And I can't tell you how disproportionate that equation has become in India. We're already talking about, the demographic dividend becoming sort of the demographic nightmare, right? And that's, I don't think that's going to help the case of responsible recruitment. There's some industries we know are, right now dead, right? And how they will come back up and what practices they will follow, it's very, very unclear. And I'll tell you one more thing, which we're adapting to as an organization, but it's probably very worrying from a traditional ILO type ethical recruitment model, is that traditional employment with fixed benefits is not popular. Right? Everyone's talking about pay for performance. Everyone's talking about, freelance contracting. And I can understand that, right? We're all going through this pandemic. We know how private businesses are operating. And I don't think that these are good signs for the next 2 years, at least. That's something I would want to put out on the table there.
Yeah, no, it's important points that definitely need to be brought into the conversation. So thank you, Amit, for doing that. And so maybe just as a last question before we open up for questions from the others, and to hope that we will see a more sort of positive trajectory, economically speaking, across industries as we head into 2021 and beyond. So kind of tying back to the question around barriers to a quality industry at scale, it'd be great if the three of you could comment on, from your own sort of operational point of view, what are the major barriers, blockages that your businesses face in terms of achieving greater scale? And to what extent is there a role for this public good organization that Rebekah and Jason were describing to play more of a sort of ecosystem building coordination role to help address some of the particular pain points that the three of you are seeing? And whoever would like to take it up first is welcome.
Okay, I guess I can give it a stab. I think currently for us, some of the biggest impediments that we have to just being able to continue to scale is, once again, I have to say incentivization for, responsible recruitment, ethical recruitment. The reality is, at least currently within the United States, we have had farms, speaking of COVID, who have allowed, 2 farm workers to die due to the disease that receive the same amount of purchase orders as farms that do responsible recruitment. And what message does that really send to the industry? is that we want this, but we're not in the place yet to quite demand it and enforce it. And so that's the first indicator that we see, that how do we get over that hump? And the reality is being able to demonstrate a scalable plan with a business plan alongside that demonstrates that this is real and viable. And so that's really the mandate Cierto has over the next 2 years, is to try to create a viable plan to scale, to demonstrate to retailers that this is possible. The second is, I myself and the team that I have, we really need to start to invest more and more in technology. Technology is going to be one of the aspects that allow us to turn into an exponential organization. And so really identifying the areas that can be applicable, and in turn knowing the impact that that's also going to have to the workforce we recruit, right? Because now we're bringing in a new predicament of wanting to have a workforce that also can understand and access this technology in a manner that's going to help us do the work that we do. So I'd say those are the two largest ones that we see right now. The reality is that I think we need to continue to focus on economic value, further demonstrating an impact analysis that shows what we are doing is actually creating better business, until that tide changes, or we end up continuing to work with governments and other agencies that create regulations that further demonstrate the need to prove responsible recruitment. And so, that's, I guess, in a nutshell, I think the challenges we have. Thank you.
We'll change the order a bit. So I'll go next. So I think, Joe's hit my main point, which is, creating engagement with employers and creating incentives for them to operate under a set of values, I think is key, because the value chain really starts there. Private organizations, I dare say, like all three of myself and the co-panelists, we want to make money from those organizations. So, we're consigned to follow, and ultimately we have to choose a yes or no. There's very little areas where, it takes a long time to cook a client and to get them to understand the benefits of, doing things a certain way. So it's really the employers who dictate this. And space for organizations like LAMP and the kind of work that was showcased today, brilliant. I think at a policy level, if that can help create consolidated demand, so that employers are not operating in hyper competitive environments, right? The problem happens, you create a nice policy, but if everyone is still going against tenders and they want to give the lowest salaries, or they want to cut corners in the recruitment and the mobilization process, there's very little that the policy eventually contributes. So, it's one hand of the government which may want to, follow a responsible set of practices, but it's another set of another arm of the government which, is saying that, we just want the best bang for the buck. And that's, we see it in India, for example, where recruitment is actually a highly taxed activity. So, the GST is not a very popular word in the country, but when we recruit workers out of India, we actually pay 18% tax. And we've been lobbying the government for a long time. So it's one section of the Ministry of External Affairs is telling us that we don't want you to charge the workers, right? But there's another section which is then taxing, us sending workers abroad. So really, it's those kind of spaces which I think, platforms such as LAMP, I'm sure can contribute, and I hope they do.
And I don't know if I could, I'm just going to wind up repeating Joe and Ami because I agree with everything they said. But I think what the heart of it is that it's all about the client. It's all about the money. So domestic work, for example, I think is a great example of this, of a household is the end client. So the household can demand a domestic worker who has been ethically recruited. But when you're talking about large construction projects, you need whoever is the client in that situation to be flowing them through their tendering processes Ami was talking about, down to the contractor throughout the supply chain. They need to set the expectation. So you need to have the money in the room if you're going to kind of achieve the quality mobility industry at scale that we're talking about. I think when I was thinking about my wish list for Terra, two other things came to mind. The first is that there is absolutely a space for an organization like LAMP. And at a very practical level, bringing the people in the room, not just to have a nice conversation about responsible recruitment, but to form new business relationships, I think is just an incredible value add. So if Ambe wants to expand to a new destination country, or if Cierto wants to scale its offerings, that you have the right people in the room to be able to have those conversations. I think the complexities of navigating different migration corridors are extremely technical to begin with. But then you factor in the fact that most recruitment and migration patterns are built on these relationships that have existed for 30, 40, 50 years. For new entrants, that's extremely challenging to overcome. So there is absolutely room for an organization or a platform like LAMP to fill that need. And the final thing I would say is just to Amit's point on COVID. There is tremendous pressure and great risk in the entire overseas labor recruitment industry, but there's also opportunity. And I think that's one message I might want to leave here today with, of there are recruitment actors that are essentially distressed assets. And so if we're thinking from a systems perspective about how do we want to take advantage of some of the opportunities that exist, funding ethical recruitment, funding responsible recruitment actors to scale to new origin countries, new destination countries, to expand their network of operations, or to work with the existing industry to transform how business is done. These are all good approaches that we should be thinking about. So I guess I would end with a very selfish fund Cierto, fund Ambe, fund Terra plea as part of this.
Great, thank you all. Yeah, let's open it up to questions from others here in the group. And I think because we have a relatively intimate group, as I guess Zuzana or Rebekah mentioned before, please just turn on your camera and unmute yourself and speak up if you have a question.
Hi there. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, hi.
My name is Leanne, and I work for the Government of Canada in the Immigration Department. So my question is very much thinking about that. I work on migrant worker protection policy and as well, of course, ethical recruitment, what we're calling a lot of different words today here. I hear them. But I think my question is really for the panelists. First of all, thank you very much for all the presentations and all of these insights. Very, very useful for me. I guess it's a selfish question. I heard a few times comments around limited capacity of government, issues with enforcement, and so on. But from a destination government's perspective, do you have recommendations coming from quality migration industry, as we're calling it today, for regulators in that space? I think regulators have a lot of challenges from many perspectives on this issue. In Canada, we're a federal state, so provinces have the jurisdiction over this, but of course, immigration policy is done at the federal level, so there's a lot of intersection there. And then, of course, there's extraterritorial questions in terms of jurisdictions when it comes to regulating those outside of domestic borders. So maybe from a regulatory perspective or otherwise, I hear funding is something that you need, but outside of that, structurally, what do you need from governments? Because I heard a lot around industry and what you do in that space, but what do you need from destination countries, especially when there is political will or windows in those jurisdictions? And thanks very much.
Whoever would like to jump in, please.
Hello, please can you hear me? Sorry, I'm not able to turn on my video. Sorry for that. My name is Emmanuel Clifford, and I work with the Emergence Group for Children and Youth as the Africa point. I have my question throughout the discussion. I'm just thinking around how the Africa Free Trade Agreement fit into some of these conversations when we are talking about mobility and how some certain countries will be able to take advantage of it, especially in Africa. I don't know, but specifically I have a question for Alex. He mentioned that they do a lot of recruitment within the Africa, but he did mention specific countries, and I want to find out what specific countries that they do recruitment in, and probably also what are the specific industry that they target. And then also maybe fairly, because I've heard a lot in the Asian context and other things, and probably if you'll be able to also support to understand what the industry look like in the African region. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just, let's do a bundle. So I got a message from Stephen Smith about, like a lot of businesses give lip service to, their adherence to ethics and standards, but many actually fall short in delivery. And so from your perspective on the recruiting side, what do you look for in a potential receiving partner, employer, that suggests that they actually, how to tell like who is a good employment partner and who's really going to adhere to their end of the bargain in terms of ethical and quality arrangements. And so maybe we'll, just given the time that we have, kind of start with those three. I guess, Alex, there was one sort of particularly to you, so maybe you could start and take that. Joe, I suspect you might have a point of view on the regulation and the regulator question. And Amit, maybe we could ask you to comment on this third one around sort of what a good partners look like. But please, if you would like to comment further on any of the other questions beyond what I just suggested, feel free.
No, thank you for those questions. And I feel like they kind of naturally flow through each other. So that works very well. I think starting with the employer question, just very briefly, due diligence. Like, I mean, the industry has done this for a long time. You need to do basic due diligence on who you're entering a contractual arrangement with. So part of our worker welfare system is basic due diligence on our clients. I think the tension there, as Amit was mentioning, is you work so hard to build a business relationship. How hard do you then push when you get to the point of doing business together to go through all of your due diligence requirements? So I think that's a tension that exists. But basic things like collecting a worker welfare policy is a very light touch approach. On Tara's involvement in West Africa, we've been operating in West Africa, I think, since 2016. And a lot of the programs that we run there have to do with safe migration. Specific countries include the Gambia, Nigeria, and places like that. But I think one of the bringing in ethical recruitment more specifically into the equation, different origin countries have different licensing requirements, and there are certain origin countries where new entrants just can't start under the current regulatory regime. So getting a little bit more at Leanne's point, or I should say Leanne's question, one of the roles of government is simply opening up some of those possibilities, either through multilateral engagement and diplomatic engagement to change some of the recruitment regulations to make it friendly for new entrants in a responsible manner, or to fund different kinds of investment in certain origin countries. Final thought on Leanne's question would just be, what can regulators do? I think what Joe is talking about is the perfect example, which is the farm that operates ethically and the farm that operates unethically. Government needs to hold the farm that operates unethically accountable. And so if government is playing that role, then the market for ethical recruitment services is going to exponentially grow. So in the Gulf, for example, when we see large projects like Expo 2020 that are doing unprecedented things to hold the entire supply chain accountable, extensive audits, cracking down on violations, the market for better standards in recruitment has grown quite a bit, but that's a tiny fraction of the overall UAE demand for recruitment. So a few thoughts on those questions.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe I can ask, on the regulator side, if there's a way to sort of put a finer point on, any ideas around achieving that level of accountability that needs to be there. Maybe that's a good place to wrap for now. I know we're a little truncated on the questions, but I know Zuzana had some closing remarks, and we can figure out the right way to share information so that people have a chance to follow up further. So I don't know, Joe or Amit, if you had a comment on the regulation piece.
So if just taking off from what you were talking about, Darin, India has a structured system called immigrant, where all the demand which goes to the structured industry actually gets consolidated, and they actually have they proposed a rating algorithm for employers as well as the recruitment agents. There's obviously been a lot of pushback because what are the parameters you use? There's been a lot of debate around that. But that really is I think it's a novel idea and something which, so can you incentivize employers who have higher ratings? Can you reduce the cost of sponsorship? To Leanne's point, just one simple point would of course be the cost of sponsorship that countries impose in terms of the visas. In the Middle East, there are countries where the costs of sponsorship itself are quite high. Even in Canada, for example, we've recruited students for work and study programs, and when they want to go out and find a final job, the LMI, you need to employ a Canadian lawyer, and can be quite expensive. So, that's something they should be thinking about as well, because eventually private companies pay this money, and somewhere, either through, if you're going to restrict the recruitment process, they'll get lower salaries. I mean, that's how private enterprises operate, right? So the government should obviously be thinking about the costs that they're going to impose on migration. Is just one humble suggestion I have.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with what Amit said. I work directly with the Canadian government through their Patat program, as well as through various other programs to recruit farm workers or different type of workers with animal expertise, animal husbandry, to go to Canada. And I think recognizing that there does need to be a tiered maybe approach to pricing and fees for access to these visas or permanent residential programs. When you're looking at a worker in Mexico who only makes possibly $15,000 a year, and they now need to pay for all of their testing and all of their visas and to get to their city to depart to Canada is quite a bit of money that they take on. So that's one aspect. Another challenge that we've had is, as a responsible recruiter, we feel the need to develop relationships with the different government regulators to at least be informed. And so maybe one area would be to, like Amit said, promote these employers as well as those that are providing the labor force and the recruiters, and recognizing them. Because one of the challenges we have is that folks rotate. So every 2 years or every 4 years, we have a new government official that we need to then build a relationship with, right? So how is it that we can streamline that possibility and the reputation that we have built previously so that continues to exist and be built upon and not need to be restarted? But yeah, I'll leave it at there. And I just want to thank everyone as well for the day and for the wonderful questions, and all the panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you all so much, Joe, Alex, Amit, and sorry we didn't have more time for questions. We will anticipate that better next time around. And Zuzana, I'll turn it back over to you to close out.
Thank you so much, Darin. Yes, exactly as you said. Thank you so much to everybody who participated today, to our speakers, to our panelists. It was a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we all could be here much longer and continue debating this crucial issue. Unfortunately, our time is up, so I'll just remind everyone that our report is now published on our website, and recording of this event will be there later today. So please, if you could just share it with your networks, and stay tuned for LAM's future events. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.